Donald Trump called him tough. Rush Limbaugh read one of his articles live on his radio show. Ann Coulter tweeted that article to her 1.5 million followers and declared, "Every sentence is perfect." Ladies and gentlemen, your host, former chief editor of the Jewish Press, Elliot Resnick.
Welcome to the Elliot Resnick Show. With us today is Bryan Caplan. That's Caplan with a C. Caplan is a professor of economics at George Mason University, a research fellow at the Mercatus Center, and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He has appeared on C-SPAN, Fox News, and ABC, and has written for such outlets as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He has also published several books with titles like Don't Be a Feminist, The Case Against Education, The Myth of the Rational Voter, and his latest, Build, Baby, Build. Professor Caplan, welcome to the program.
Fantastic to be here, Elliot.
We have a lot to get to, but first, let me start with what may seem like a weird question. Why do you spell your last name Caplan with a C?
The simple reason is that's the way my family spelled it. There is some story about how it got put down at Ellis Island. My aunt knew a little bit about it, but ultimately it's a mystery. I mean, honestly, it's only about 10 years ago that I found out that Caplan is just another variant on Cohen. So actually, Bryan Caplan is the same name as the main character in Monty Python's Life of Brian, Bryan Cohen.
Okay, there you go. I'm going to get to your new book, Build, Baby, Build, which just came out last month, which I enjoyed much more than I expected to. But first,
all right, good.
I want to talk about two of your other books, which I think might have broader appeal. And then we'll get to your latest book. Okay, so 2 years ago, you published a book called Don't Be a Feminist. My question to you is why? What's wrong with being a feminist?
Good question. The book is a book of essays, and the lead essay is called Don't Be a Feminist, a Letter to My Daughter. Really, I just got started thinking about what would I tell my daughter, who was 10 at the time, when she starts asking about feminism. And it starts off with, what is feminism anyway? There is this very popular definition that has made its way into dictionaries, just saying that feminism is the view that men and women should be treated equally, which I think is fine, but I think is a terrible definition of feminism as it's actually used. Why? Well, we actually have survey data, and it turns out that people that call themselves feminists believe that, and you know who else believes it? People who don't call themselves feminists. It's at something like 95% endorsement by everybody. So what is a good definition of feminism? Again, this is one that I think, regardless of your view on the question, this is a reasonable description of how people actually use the word. I say a good definition of feminism is something like the view that our society generally treats men more fairly than women. Why is this a good definition? Because it actually distinguishes believers from unbelievers. Virtually all feminists think that our society treats men more fairly than women. And on the other hand, people who say they're not feminists either say no, or at least, I don't know. Now, why should you not be a feminist? Now that we got the definition clear, the answer is pretty simple. We've got to look at the evidence. Is it really true that our society generally treats men more fairly than women? The answer is no. Rather, what we see is that at minimum, for every complaint that women have, there is a similarly credible complaint that men have. The actual practical effect of feminism is to lead to a hypersensitivity to any harm that women suffer and a corresponding neglect of any kind of unfairness that men endure.
Okay.
So that's the quick version. I'm happy to go over the evidence if you want.
Yeah, sure. So let me pick one example. Many people, actually including many right-leaning Americans, seem to believe that there's a wage gap that exists between men and women, that women get paid less for doing the same exact job as a man. Does this gap, in fact, exist?
Great question. And the way that you phrase it actually winds up combining one thing that's true with one thing that's false. The thing that's true is there is a wage gap. On average, men make more money than women. Now, the real question is, though, is it for doing exactly the same work as men or not? I am an economics professor, so this is a question that economists have thought a lot about. As soon as you put the question clearly, it's like, well, how would we even know? We've got to go and try matching up jobs by characteristics. And then you realize, well, not all lawyers are the same. Some lawyers work 30 hours a week. Others work 80 hours a week. To say that a female lawyer working 30 hours a week is underpaid because she makes a third of the money of a male lawyer working 80 hours a week isn't reasonable. There is a pile of actual statistical work on this question. And the quick answer is, when we go and try to do an apples to apples comparison, do we actually see any substantial pay gap? And the answer is no. There's basically a residual of maybe 5 percentage points that with very crude statistical models still seems to favor men. Even that's not totally clear. But then the question is, well, it's kind of a crude model. What are we forgetting? There's a great book called Why Men Earn More, which is primarily a self-help book for women who want to make more money. But essentially what he does is just point out a lot of the subtle differences between the jobs that men do and the jobs that women do. The overriding one really is that women are much more likely to choose work-life balance in their jobs, and men are much more likely to go and focus very heavily on money. And the end result is that women have jobs that are better for them in terms of quality of life, and men have jobs where they make more money.
One argument that conservatives make sometimes, it's a cute argument, but I think it's probably true, is that if women really earned less than men,
Mhm.
then all these, greedy capitalists would just hire all female workforces.
Yeah, that is a great point. It's one that I make in the book. Look, if you really believe this stuff, we're not talking about you could save money on pencils. We're talking about you could save money on your whole labor force, which is one of the main costs of doing business. If it was really true that you could get equally qualified women for less money, then you would just go and have a low wage strategy, and then men wouldn't want to work for you, and you'd just build an all female workforce and cash in. The fact that basically no one's trying the strategy, and it's not rocket science either. If someone said, "Oh, I've got a great plan to get rich, just cure cancer." It's like, okay, I agree that would work if you could do it, but I don't think you could cure cancer, so it's not very helpful advice. On the other hand, I got a great plan to get rich, just hire all women. That's easy. Any fool could do it. The fact that it is not a business strategy that any notable place is pushing and succeeding with shows how silly these arguments really are.
And like you said, a lot of these models, I read one of Thomas Sowell's books. He says
Mhm.
doctors, like you said with lawyers, it could be both are doctors and highly qualified and have a great education. But one, because of life work balance, is putting in extra 100 hours during the year on average, the woman
Right.
versus the man, and
Yeah,
whatnot.
in medicine, one of the main differences between men and women is that men work in the depressing areas of medicine, what are called the death specialties. You work with oncology or surgery. It's disgusting. It's depressing. You're dealing with people who are likely to die despite your best efforts. Female doctors are much more likely to work in what are called the life specialties, OBGYN, pediatrics. You can see why it feels a lot better to go and do that kind of medicine, as to why men are doing the really ugly kinds of medicine. A lot of it's money. Men are much more likely to do whatever pays the most, even if the actual life satisfaction's low. Honestly, when you go and read this book, Why Men Earn More, the main point of it is, hey, women, here's 25 ways you can make more money. Pick a few of them and do it. And the main thing I got out of it is, my God, I'm really lucky as a man that I actually chose a job with fantastic work-life balance. And if I had done a normal male job where I'm just making money doing something I don't like every day, I'd read this book and say, I want to work like a woman. I
Right.
want to go and do a job that I like, that's nice, with nice things happening all day. And like, what does that money even really buy me that much? So that's my attitude, is this book is at least as valuable for men to read, to realize, wow, women are choosing jobs that bring them a lot more fulfillment, a lot less stress. Why should I suffer?
Right, right. In recent years, we've seen the rise of young conservative stars who are encouraging women to marry younger than they
Mhm.
currently do. They argue that generally speaking, women derive greater happiness from having a family than they do from having a career,
Mhm.
and that prioritizing your career so that you don't even seriously think about marriage until you're 30 or 35 is a recipe for profound misery later in life. Do you agree?
Yeah, there's a lot to it. It's a bit exaggerated just because of Kahneman's focusing illusion. Focusing illusion says that nothing is as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it. But yes, there are a lot of ways in which having a really successful job isn't actually that fulfilling. I mean, in fact, I would say that the real evidence is that the main thing that matters for your job is, do you like the people you work with? Money is actually a minor concern in terms of your personal happiness. Now, to be totally candid, there is some evidence that I think is pretty good saying that all else equal, people with kids are a little bit less happy. But all else is not equal. In particular, you have to put this alongside people who are married are way happier than singles. Furthermore, being married without kids is actually standardly something that is not that stable. Married with kids is the stable relationship status for a whole lot of reasons, which you can dwell upon. But in any case, a big part of my book, Selfish Reason to Have More Kids, is say, look, in the data we see that all else equal, having kids seems to make people a little bit less happy. But this isn't so surprising when you see how poorly parents arrange their lives and how much suffering that is totally needless and unproductive they endure. I'd say, well, I blame the parents, not the kids. If you spend your every day going and driving your kid around 3 hours to activities and being bored out of your mind at the activities, then yeah, that's not a very good life. It's also one that is totally optional and you don't need to do it in order to be a decent parent.
Right. Interesting.
Right. And on that general point, I'd also just say that there is a range of how people react to different situations. There really are some people who don't appreciate having kids. And of course, there's a lot of people who don't appreciate having a good job either. So the really good advice is spend more time thinking about which kind of person you really are. Don't assume that you're someone that's going to get a lot of fulfillment out of your job. What I would tell my own kids is definitely this. Look, there is a much wider range of life choices than you are hearing about. And the option of going and getting married and having kids when you're 20 is one that almost no people from middle-class families or higher are thinking about today. And yet it is one that many people would actually like, especially compared to their alternatives. Always remember the alternatives, which for a lot of people just being totally alone.
Right, right. On your point about being happy, I read one or two of, well, actually more than one or two of Charles Murray's books. And in one of those books, he tries to distinguish between different kinds of happiness.
Very
The sort
reasonable.
of superficial happiness, go to an amusement park, or you have a good piece of food, or the kind of happiness that at your deathbed, you look back on your life and it's like sort of a profound, deeper happiness. And he was arguing that there's very few things that give you this deeper type of happiness. And one of them is kids. So maybe when you're having them, when they're, vomiting on the floor, you're not happy in the moment, but overall, long term, you have a sort of deeper happiness than you would if you did not have them.
Right. I would tend to think that what Murray is talking about is better called meaning rather than happiness. There's also psychological research on that, which is very consistent with what Murray says. So while a lot of parents will say that childcare is not the happiest part of their day, they will still frequently say it's the most meaningful part of their day. And that's something where I would say at least take that seriously and consider it. I would say it makes sense to distinguish short run versus long run happiness. Don't put too much weight on how you're feeling today if there's a trade-off. And it's real life. So often there is a trade-off between being really happy on this very day versus being happy over the longer run.
2018, you wrote a book called The Case Against Education. What kind of education exactly do you oppose? The kind driven by intellectual curiosity or the kind driven by pragmatic calculus? Let me be more specific. In the olden days, say before 100 years ago, many kids in the Western world went to school until they were young teenagers, at which point they went to work. If they were very smart and interested in knowledge, they went to college perhaps. Not because they wanted a job, but because they loved wisdom and wanted to develop their character. Today, almost everyone goes to college or is at least expected to go to college, not because they love knowledge, but because they're told they won't get a good job if they don't. Is your book, The Case Against Education, targeted at this second group of people who just want a good job, or is it also targeted at the first group of people who love knowledge?
Actually, I'll say it's targeted at neither of those.
Okay, sorry.
Really, the book is about the idea that government should go and subsidize education so that we get a whole lot of it, because this is going and either preparing people for great careers or because it's so enriching for them. First of all, most of what you learn in school is of no use in the real world. And so really what happens when government subsidizes it, you get what I call credential inflation. Actually, it's not just me, it's a standard term. So essentially, if you go to school and learn practical skills, then you can go and get a better job because you now know how to do more. But I say the main reason why education pays is just getting stamps on your forehead, which means that from the point of view of one individual, it does make sense to go and get those degrees so that you can compete with other people. But as a society, it's very foolish to subsidize it because it's just a rat race. If everyone has a stamp on their head, you need 2 stamps to get the good job. And then similarly, while I'm all in favor of people being curious, I say that the idea that education enriches people's souls in the real world as it's practiced is basically wishful thinking, and that hardly anyone actually is in school because they're genuinely curious. Even at very top schools, the level of careerism is pretty much off the charts.
But would you be okay with, I don't know the numbers, but say in Thomas Jefferson's generation, so he went and he didn't go for a job. He went because he,
Yeah.
I guess, loved wisdom.
Yeah.
And it's probably like 5% or even less than 5% at that point in time that went to college. Would you be okay with that model? Or
Yeah, so that's totally fine. I think that it's easy to start glamorizing what education was like in the past, and the reality is probably a lot of it was just to be a country club for rich guys. And in terms of how much they actually cared about the education even then, I think it's probably not that much either. I think it was higher than in the present. What I'd say today is you might think, well, kids at George Mason don't really care about knowledge, but if you go to Harvard, they do. I've gone and talked to kids at Harvard. I would say that they are also very careerist. The only school that I know of that is notably not so careerist is the University of Chicago. There, I've actually given talks where 200 kids show up for no extra credit to talk about ideas. But almost any other school, it's not like that.
yeah, it's funny the way I see it. Our educational system, college, high school, and elementary, whoever designed it was they weren't pragmatists because you're not learning business skills, you're not learning computer skills, you're not learning anything which is really useful in the world. You're learning things based, I think, on a model of just loving of wisdom, science, social studies, and history and math. Like algebra is not really useful in the modern world at all, or sorry, any world. But honestly, I think the person who designed the curriculum just loved knowledge and thought that math is probably, you're getting insight into God's mind or something. So it's like a weird combination. Like everyone's going to school for practical reasons, and yet the whole curriculum was designed by people who seem to care more about knowledge and not practical results.
That would be a quick assessment. I can totally see why you would think that, but it's more subtle than that. You're right that the rhyme or reason why teach this in particular rather than 100 other things, there's very little sense to it. Mostly, I think teachers taught what they were taught, and their teachers taught what they were taught, and so on back into the mists of time. The idea of an education where you go and learn history, foreign language, literature, this stuff all comes from a bygone era. There have been some modifications, like physical science got added into the curriculum in the 19th century, whereas previously it wasn't really there. I think they had astronomy and math, but they didn't have practical modern sciences in there. I have criticized universal algebra, although I do think it's quite a bit more useful than you're saying. There's a lot of jobs where you don't understand algebra, you just couldn't do it. You can't be a programmer and not understand algebra. For example, you need to understand that in order to write the code. You might say, well, AI is going to do it in the future. Well, first of all, that's recent. Until recently, you needed it. But even there, you can't second guess the AI without knowing the algebra. So there's definitely some narrow careers that it does make sense. But yeah, for most kids, it's ridiculous and totally pointless.
So I mean, I've been talking on a more, I guess, higher level or cosmic level, or I'm not sure the proper word, but let's just get a little bit too pragmatic. So I mean, what do you actually encourage younger people to do? Do you encourage them to well, I'm not even sure you're allowed to skip high school legally anymore. But in your ideal world, would you skip high school? Would you go to elementary school? Would you go to college? What's practically do you think people should be
Well,
doing?
practically, as long as kids need daycare, then they're going to be in something like a school. All right. So there's that. That was a truism that COVID brought out in utmost clarity because suddenly parents realize, yeah, like whether or not they learn anything isn't that big of a deal, but whether they have in-person daycare is a huge deal. Changes
Right.
my life and changes their life. And also they don't get to have friends. So I think that as long as kids are at an age where they need supervision from an adult, then we're going to have something like school. It could be pretty different, but that is just going to exist in almost any society where adults want to do something else. And then the only remaining question is, when do they leave?
Right.
That's where I would say, look, starting from an age of 10 or 12, start exposing kids to a lot of plausible career paths. Not the thing that we do now. It's like, oh, you could be a poet or an historian or a mathematician or a professional athlete. Basically, right now, we expose kids to a bunch of pipe dreams, and then you finish and it's like, oh, yeah, none of those are actually on the realistic menu. I'm going to have to go and do elder care. I would say, hey, how about you go and tell them about elder care when they're 10? Right? Give them a couple of weeks of that. How do you like that one? Don't like that? All right. You could be an actuary. Here's how that works. I think it would be a great idea to start exposing people to common jobs. So choose them based upon statistical frequency, a minimum. And then, yeah, start tracking kids at a young age. A lot of people complain, what about the genius that gets tracked in to be a janitor? Okay, that is unfortunate. What about the future janitor where you keep making them stay in school until they have flunked out of college, filling their heads with a bunch of lies about how anyone can do math, which just isn't true.
Right.
So
And
that is the other danger that you're talking about, giving someone a pile of false hope instead of preparing them for something more realistic given their talents and preferences.
Right, right. I wrote my PhD. I'm in Jewish history on a
Mhm,
congressman who went to school for one day of his entire life. So, and many kids, I think you see this sometimes with kids who are not really making it in school.
mhm,
Um, they're not really built to, they're not so smart. They don't really love knowledge so much. They're not really good at it.
mhm.
And you give them a job, they'll feel so fulfilled. They'll be so happy and they'll mature so much quicker. And instead, you do the opposite. You keep them in the
Yeah.
school, and it's just not good for their character either, I think sometimes.
Yeah. Like there's a built-in sense that anything other than a college type job is degrading and humiliating, and it's insulting to go and say that a 10-year-old is going to do something else, or even to allow the 10-year-old to pursue other options as their focus. Right? Like the normal view is, oh, you can do anything you want in the 13 seconds that are left for you at the end of the day after doing all your school, all your homework, all your extracurricular activities. That is a silly and disingenuous approach to all this. It's like, look, the thing that they're most interested in, that should be the thing they spend most of their time on, as long as it is a realistic option. I mean, it's bizarre that we're fine with having somebody go and put almost all their time into sports, even though you know that the person isn't even the best in their high school, so they have no chance of ever having a career in that thing. It's fine to go and sacrifice the rest of your childhood for that. But to go and spend most of your time in childhood repairing cars, that's some horrible, demeaning thing. I think that's a silly idea. The main thing I would think of, riffing off of what you're saying there, is that there's a lot of especially young males who do not like school. They find it super boring. And then if you don't give them something better to do, then they're likely to actually become criminals and end up in jail. So I'd
Yeah.
say, look, for a lot of especially boys, their most likely scenario actually is gang, then jail. The share of male high school dropouts that end up in jail is real high right now. I
Yeah.
think it's actually a majority, if I remember, or maybe it's 2/3 for blacks and maybe it's only a quarter for whites. But anyway, it's real high for male high school graduates to end up in jail. Would be a lot better to have them do even the lowest status job, working McDonald's versus end up in jail. And then maybe by the time you would have been graduated from high school, you're a manager at McDonald's instead of being dead or being
Right.
in jail. Right. And
Yeah.
yet
Yeah.
there's so much wishful thinking here of, well, maybe they'll be president. Okay. Yeah. That's like one in hundreds of millions. Or maybe they could be a manager at McDonald's. That seems like a much more plausible option and one that would make sense to encourage because of its realism.
Right. 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 Okay, so finally we get to your new book, Build Baby Build, which just came out last month.
Yes.
So, first, let me say that I thought you did an excellent job with this book. For listeners who haven't seen the book, it's a serious work of nonfiction, and yet it appears in the form of a graphic novel.
Hmm.
It's actually very impressive, I thought. Perhaps I'm arrogant, but when I read most books or I see the accomplishments of most people, I say to myself that I could do that too if I just worked really hard. I don't think that's true of Build Baby Build. It's extremely creative, both the text and the illustrations, and I honestly do not think I could have ever written this book no matter how hard I tried. So, first of all, kudos to you.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Don't sell yourself short. Look, honestly, I just started off as a fanboy. I can't draw. What happened is I spent about a decade reading graphic novels and thinking about how they work. I got a lot of inspiration from the books of Scott McCloud, who has these how-to graphic novels. One's called Making Comics, another one's called Understanding Comics. He has another one, Reinventing Comics. Anyway, so I read those books 10 times each at least, read a lot of other books, and just tried to start thinking, how would I go and express this in graphic novel form? And then I got some comics editing software and started playing around with it, just trying to use what I learned. I'm not someone who just writes a script. I do full storyboarding using Google Images and this comics editing software. And then I find an artist that I micromanage. Essentially, I think about the visuals in my mind. I use Google Images to get more visual ideas. And then I try to figure out a way of communicating it to an artist. And then I basically just hound them until they make it look just the way that I want.
Interesting, interesting. Oh, thank you for
Right.
all
But
that.
anyway, so like I believe that any smart person smart and creative person could do this. But it's like other things where you need to learn from the masters so you may steal from them.
Right.
And then you just start practicing and figuring out what works. I mean, a lot of the reason why I do storyboarding of my books is I cannot visualize a page just from typing a script. I've got to actually lay out, this is going to be a page with 4 panels and it's going to be 3 smaller ones on the left and then one long vertical one on the right. And then I play around with the zoom and the positioning and the words. And then by doing that, I realize, okay, this isn't going to work because there's too many words. There's not enough words, or it's too confusing to go and do the visual transitions. It's hard to follow the action. And then I go and keep modifying it until I think that the reader's going to be able to follow what I'm doing. Actually, honestly, I am in principle going to be the editor of a whole series of nonfiction graphic works published by the Cato Institute. I'm just still having trouble recruiting people that want to write books like this. I thought it'd be a bit easier because I know a lot of nerds who love the genre. It's like, you too can do it. Just give it a try and just jump in. The water's fine, man.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to get to the content of the book now. You write that the prices for housing, adjusted for inflation, have doubled over the last 40 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they're so high now that it doesn't pay for many blue-collar workers to move to a big city, you write. Yes, they'll make more money if they do, but they'll also have less money in their bank account at the end of the day due to the high cost.
The extra rent eats up more than 100% of the salary gain.
Right. So they're better off staying essentially in Alabama or wherever else they're from. Mm-hmm. So my question is this: how in the world did housing prices get so high when the general trend in economics is for items to get cheaper over time, not more expensive?
Right. So the answer really comes down to crazy government regulation that makes it really hard to build stuff. In the past, there was regulation of housing, but it was fairly mild. And so housing markets basically work like they do in standard introductory economics textbooks. Namely, you have an increase in demand. This means that prices go up, but it also means that prices are temporarily above average cost. Anytime prices are above average cost, this is basically the market picking up a bullhorn and saying, free money, just go and make this product the market price and you will make more than it costs to make and you'll get rich. That's the way that markets normally work. And what it means is that when prices are temporarily above average cost, there's entry and you keep getting entry until prices fall back down to this break-even level. That's how housing markets worked for decades, probably for many centuries before that. But starting in the 70s and 80s in the United States, regulation got to be so intense that the entry of new housing wasn't anywhere near enough to keep up with demand. And so the long run trend is for prices to keep getting higher and higher. It does vary based upon the part of the country that you're in. Some places are a lot worse than average, like San Francisco or New York. Some are better than average, like the middle of nowhere. But still, the average for the country has been something like double the physical cost of actually making it, including the land you need. And this is entirely caused by government making it really hard to get the pieces of paper necessary to be allowed to build stuff.
Okay, so there's a lot there, but I think some of what you just said maybe will be clarified through my next question. So years ago, I was debating rent control with someone. Mm-hmm. He essentially argued that without rent control, lower middle class people like him wouldn't be able to afford living in Manhattan. My response was that in a truly free market, the heads of businesses, say restaurant owners, for example, would probably provide affordable housing for their own workers because they need workers and won't be able to find enough of them in Manhattan if housing in Manhattan is unaffordable. In your book, though, you argue that the premise on which I built my argument is incorrect, essentially. Mm-hmm. You argue that in a truly free market, janitors, restaurant waiters, construction workers, and all sorts of other people will easily be able to find affordable housing in Manhattan. Explain, why would it be so easily affordable?
Yeah, so easily is a little bit optimistic. Okay, sorry. Because, here's the thing is, housing in Manhattan is sufficiently expensive that the price could fall by a factor of 4, and still a janitor might find it a big sacrifice. But nevertheless, directionally, you're totally right. I'm saying that the cost of housing in New York City would probably be something like a quarter of what it is now, maybe a fifth of what it is now in a really free market, although it would take a long time.
Why would housing be so much cheaper if there were no regulations? How would that work exactly?
So here's the thing. We have the technology to build enormous quantities of housing quite cheaply if the government just lets people do what they know how to do. Right? If you just go and take a look at Central Park from a helicopter, you'll see that Central Park is ringed by a bunch of buildings that are like 6 stories tall, with very few exceptions. In a free market, probably there would be hundreds of additional 40-story buildings surrounding Central Park. Now, if you will go and allow all this extra production, the firms that build that housing are going to have to cut price in order to actually fill the units. It is just like you show up at a lemonade stand with 10 gallons of lemonade. How are you going to sell it all? You're going to have to cut the price. To be clear, building a 100-story building, the cost does get to be pretty high, but 40 stories, well, a lot less per floor. So I think that is a likely equilibrium. And that would be a crazy additional amount of housing. You just look at the map and say, wow, we could easily have 5 times as many people living here, 5 times as much square footage. And if you have that much extra square footage, then part of it is people just spread out and get bigger places because they're so much more affordable. Another thing is more people wind up living there. There's also more generally, we don't need to be New York focused. Like if you get outside of major cities, there's a lot of regulation against multifamily housing. Something like 80% of all residential land in the US is zoned for single family. This is another way that you can go and make cheap housing for people and make it abundant. Doesn't have to be small apartments. You don't have to be in a closet. You can have a big apartment, one with ample room, but by not wasting space, by having empty area between buildings, you can squeeze a lot more people in. And also, of course, by doing more floors. Not too many people want to live in a 6-story house, but a lot of people would be happy to live in a 6-story apartment building where you each have a floor. Right? And then finally, even just dealing with single family housing, there's a lot of regulation that prescribes a minimum lot size. Often it's an acre or more per house. And again, this winds up strangling the supply of housing. Now, if you've never done inter-econ, it's a pretty simple idea, which is that if you let people build a lot more stuff, the price will fall, not because builders are charity workers, but because if you have a big stock of something and you want to sell it, you've got to cut the price due to competition. When there is a scarcity supply relative to demand, then you pay high prices. When there's an abundant supply relative to demand, then you pay low prices. Everything I'm talking about in this book is getting rid of these artificial strangulations of the housing market so we can have abundance and therefore cheapness.
Okay, so when I was studying American Jewish history for my PhD, a major part of one of the courses about American Jewish history, probably because the professor was teaching what his professor taught him, probably the original professor was less leaning, was how crowded, sorry?
Tenements?
Yeah, the tenements,
Yes,
how crowded it used to
I've been
be.
in the Tenement Museum in New York.
Okay.
Have you been there?
I have not. I've heard about it.
Yes.
But so you know the basic story, like
Yes.
there was progress because then the city passed a law, and you actually
Yes.
had to have like a foot of space between the window. So explain why that story is not correct. Because again,
Right.
intuitively, the average person thinks, "Oh gosh, it must have been terrible to live so crowded." And thank heavens the government made laws that required you to have a little more space and a little more windows, air coming into your apartment. So why is that story incorrect?
Passing a law saying that you can't build housing with small units doesn't mean that someone has any better choice than they had before. It just means they're going to have to figure out someplace else to live. So if you're living in a small place and government passes a law saying everybody has to have a nice, comfortable area, then either you could go and pay through the nose to stay where you are, or you could go and get a really long commute and live in a place more distant. Or, as is often the case for tenement dwellers, you stay back in Russia and endure the pogroms. Right? That's
Right,
what
so
that's
that was
the other stuff we're talking about.
So that's essentially what would happen. You're saying fewer people would have come to Lower East
Yes.
Side altogether.
So if you get a letter, so look, why do people come? Primarily because they get letters from friends and relatives saying it's a huge improvement here. If you're spending 2/3 of your income on rent, then you are probably not going to send the letter home saying it's a huge improvement. Probably going to send the letter home saying, we thought it'd be so great, but we have to go and spend almost every penny that we have on rent. Our kids are going hungry. It's bad. Right? It really is like saying you can't have cheap food because everyone should be eating at nice restaurants. And it's like, well, when you pass that law, one possibility is people will eat very small quantities at nice restaurants. Another thing is that they will starve.
Right.
That's what we're talking about. Yes. I mean, this is the kind of idiocy that economists have been rolling their eyes at for ages. Look, it's one thing to say, you're suffering. I feel sorry for you. Here's some money so you can have a better life. It's something to say, hey, you're suffering. Tell you what, you can move into my apartment and you can share it with me and you'll have a better life. These are ways that actually do help people. Just passing a law saying that low quality stuff cannot be sold is madness.
But it's interesting because so much of free market thinking is, I'm not sure if counterintuitive is too strong of a word, but it's not what you immediately think of. Like, and again, the regular history you learn in school. So there's, there's what was called the Triangle Factory fire. So, therefore, from now on, we must have fire escapes in every single building. And that sounds reasonable to your average person. And it's like always requires someone to come and say, well, here's why it's not reasonable, because you have this trade-off.
So here's what I say. I say that basic economics, not the sophisticated stuff, but basic econ, I think is totally intuitive. But what it is it's counter-emotional. It's saying, yeah, well, that sounds like a good idea, except if someone really wanted to live in a nice place, why didn't they do it themselves already out of their own money? And it's like, oh, yeah, because they felt like it was too expensive and they'd rather have their money for other priorities. I don't think it's that hard to understand. Like a regulation that was widely beloved is the minimum wage. And it's like everybody should be guaranteed a living wage by the government. Well, does passing a minimum wage ensure that everybody gets a good job? No, it just means that either you get a good job or you have no job or you have an illegal job.
Right.
That's the other. And now you may say, well, that's counterintuitive. Like, is it? Think about any time you've ever filled out a job application that has a line saying salary requirements. Why don't you put $1 million an hour?
Right.
Everybody has some instant sense of I put an unreasonably high wage, I am going to be reducing the chance I get this job. It's the same argument for the minimum wage, and it's one that every teenager, when faced with the question, actually does understand almost certainly. Like maybe there's a few that are so clueless, but you don't need to be sophisticated to realize asking for too much makes it more likely you get nothing. And that's the way that a lot of government regulation works. It says either you get the deal that we think every human being is entitled to, or tough luck, you get nothing.
Right. There's a libertarian Tom Woods. You've probably heard of him somewhere along the line.
I walked around DC with him once 15 years ago. Right.
So
and though an historian, he disliked the city so much he hadn't seen most of it.
Okay. So he writes, he's quoting someone else's work. I don't remember who it was. Someone actually asked a lot of workers, and I think it was China, would you prefer fewer hours?
Mm-hmm.
They work slave labor. They work like 12 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually went to these women and said, would you prefer a law that requires your boss only let you work for 8 hours? Or would you actually prefer the extra money that you get by working 12 hours? And the vast majority of them said, no, I actually want the extra money.
Yeah. Now, if you would put it in vaguer terms of should the government protect workers to make sure they're not overworked, then I think they would have given the standard answer. Of course, it's the duty of our workers' government to protect us from these rapacious capitalists.
Right.
But if you personalize it, you realize, well, wait a second. So you're telling me that I'm actually going to have to get by on less income? I mean, here's the thing that is obvious when you think about it. And it's, look, almost everybody on earth has a range of different job options. People that you think of as having no choice but to work in a coal mine, yeah, they could also work in a restaurant. They could work on a farm. There are part-time jobs. There's always options. When you put yourself in the shoes of another person, what you realize is if I were a different person, I would have a different menu of choices, probably a worse menu of choices. If you're me, like I'm fantastically fortunate, but it doesn't mean that you don't have multiple possibilities. Almost everybody's got multiple possibilities, no matter how tough their life is. And then the question is, well, why are you doing this one when you got multiple ones? And the obvious answer is, because this is my least bad option. This is my least bad option.
I just saw a clip by Milton Friedman. I'm sorry to bore you because you probably know everything I'm saying, but
it's not like I was just writing about Milton today. Tell me what Milton said. I miss Milton.
That's what he was saying. Because we all get the standard education in our elementary school, it's important to counter some of the standard images we get. So, we all have this like Charles Dickens image, of the poor factory worker working in very bad conditions, the soot all over his face. And Milton Friedman said, yes, things were not so great, but what happened was during the Industrial Revolution, you took the misery that used to belong in the farm out of sight, out of mind, and now it's all together in the city. So now you see it all, and it looks very bad. It's not the case that there was no misery before. There was misery before.
Yeah, so actually, anytime a history textbook is in my sight, I grab it, go to the index on the Industrial Revolution, and read what it says. When I did this for my sons when they were in 5th grade, the first paragraph started talking about workers losing their fingers in factories. Because that's the main point of the Industrial Revolution, to amputate fingers. And it's not like anyone ever lost a body part on a farm by swinging an axe the wrong way. Give me a freaking break. What you're doing is you are complaining about something that existed in all human societies, but you single out the Industrial Revolution, which is the beginning of the process that changed the world so that hardly anyone loses any body parts in the job. And then you go and complain about it. And that's what really happened. And if you read this chapter, the fact that the Industrial Revolution led to a massive increase in human production and therefore living standards is grudgingly admitted somewhere in the middle. And the main thing is poor workers. Like, what folly. Like another great example of this, of course, is everybody crying tears over the plight of guest workers in the Gulf monarchies. oh, those poor workers and they're suffering and they're not treated as equals and their passports get confiscated. Why do you think they keep coming? Do you think that the friends and relatives that are getting them jobs don't have phones? They got phones, they're calling home, and what they're telling them is, right, it's not perfect here, just in case you thought I might be in the perfect country that doesn't exist, but I make 5 times as much money as I did back in our village in Pakistan. I'm going to do this for 10 years and I'm going to come home and I'm going to be the richest man in the village. That's what they're actually going and telling them. That's the standard thing. Uh, has anyone ever been held as a slave in the Gulf monarchies? Presumably so, but that's ultra unusual. The workers there are desperately trying to get in, not to get home. And what is the normal punishment for a Gulf monarchy guest worker that, say, protests the government? They deport you. So if you want to get sent back to your country, you can. Countries that hardly let in any low-skilled workers feel superior to the Gulf monarchies when really the Gulf monarchies actually do have the best immigration policy in the world for low-skilled workers. Why? Because they let them come and work.
So what do you do when you pick up your son's textbook and you find a paragraph like that?
Well, I mean, I've actually, all of my kids have heard my spiel on this many times.
Okay.
And when it comes up, I give them the spiel again. If it's particularly hilarious, I'll say, well, you get a load of this ridiculous textbook and just how absurdly biased it is against the Industrial Revolution. It would be as dumb as saying that during the Industrial Revolution, people died of old age. Like, yeah, they were dying of old age before too.
Yeah.
Like it's just, and also there was bad breath. Like it's throwing complaints at a system that you obviously dislike for totally other reasons that apply to every system. And what's the real complaint? The real complaint is they don't like the business. They don't like rich people making money and they're resentful.
I wonder if this would apply in a really free market society. Because I always say, I'm Jewish and
Really?
Orthodox
You're
Jewish
kidding.
also. So
I would never have guessed that, Elliot.
yeah, because I talk such a waspy type way.
And all the I
Um,
figure Jewish history majors are just packed with Gentiles of every description.
there are some. I actually always wonder about them, why they
All right,
enter that
but in
field.
any
But
case,
yes, in the Orthodox Jewish community, if someone gives money to fund the private school, the yeshiva, or gives money to the synagogue, or to a camp fund, send kids to camp, he's then honored at all these yeshiva dinners and community dinners. And in the country, we vilify them because of the welfare state. Not only do they provide 90% of the welfare state, they don't even get a thank you for it. And we should have like a national thank you day,
yeah.
which they don't get. Whereas if there was no welfare state, and you actually have to approach a rich man and say, could you please sponsor a library? Could you please sponsor? They would actually be honored. Instead, they're vilified. No one even appreciates what they give. Everything's distorted.
I think it has deeper roots than that. You're right that I think that would be a much better system. And it's also true that philanthropy is very common among the super rich and has been for centuries. I think there is a specific targeting of people who earn their money. What's really striking to me is that magazines like The Nation have way more pieces lashing out at billionaires who made their money by delivering products that people like than against the Saudi monarchy. It's like
Interesting.
what are you even thinking? Like, those people really are parasites. They're like billionaires who just suck a country dry and like live high off the hog, flying around the world, buying themselves yachts and mansions. What do they ever create? And yet you just sort of act like that's not that big of a deal. Whereas Jeff Bezos is the guy you actually want to make a dartboard and throw darts at. It's a pretty demented set of priorities.
Yeah.
I actually have been thinking of writing a piece on this very theme you're mentioning, which is if governments actually wanted to go and just cultivate more goodwill, they would go and have banquets honoring the biggest taxpayers in the country, and there'd be a party at the White House, and or at least you get a thank you note from the IRS. Say, look,
Right.
like we understand that you may feel that those taxes were excessive. It's a democracy. We can disagree about these things, but let just be understood that whatever our disagreements, we really appreciate what you've done. You've done a lot. You pay a lot more in taxes than you're ever going to use in services. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then to
Right.
realize this would be very unpopular, and I think it's pretty clear why. There's just a lot of people like, we shouldn't have to thank them for it. They owe us. Like the level of resentment, like I would rather that we not get the money than we have to say thank you. It does take me back to when I was a kid, and occasionally my mom would say you have to write a thank you note to a relative for a $5 gift. And you sit there going, I don't want to write the letter. I really don't want to write the letter. I don't like this person very much, and I definitely don't want to thank them. And it's like, Yeah, this probably is more of your own neuroses than anything about this claim, which is totally sensible to thank people for contributing a lot more than they take away.
I wonder though, I mean, obviously the educated leftist unfortunately would react that way. I wonder though, if a regular
Hmm.
normal person, if you said this doctor visit you just had was made possible because of top 1% of the country donated their money,
Hmm.
so you should be able to have a free hospital visit.
Hmm.
I wonder if they would feel
Hmm.
resentful. I
I
think
mean,
some
if
people,
if it was a donation, probably not. But if you just said rich taxpayers paid for 98% of your visit, yeah, I think that. So here's the thing: is that resentment of the rich is a basic human emotion that most people have to work pretty hard to get rid of. A few people probably don't feel it, but it's quite normal. And then what leftist ideology does is take an emotion and turn it into a philosophy. So you take what people feel quite naturally, and then you say, this gets a book justifying the emotion.
interesting. No, maybe because it's mandatory. Because again, I'm thinking the Orthodox Jewish community, and again,
Mhm,
obviously we're educated religiously, so you're educated with certain values, which maybe hopefully overcome some of your
mhm,
natural resentment. Maybe I don't
mhm,
know. Well, presumably it does. It's questions to what degree, but I mean, I think at least in the religious community, I don't know anyone who's a recipient of charity who feels resentment to the person who's giving him the charity. I don't think it happens very much. Um,
yeah, yeah,
Maybe it's local.
so like here's the thing. Suppose that you aren't very fond of the person. You don't get along with your dad and he says I'm going to pay for your school, right? That kind of thing. Or it's an uncle that you've never really liked who chews with his mouth open and talks too loud at the Seder. This is one where like some people are mature enough to say this is obviously a really nice, generous person. Everybody has certain minor character flaws. I am not perfect myself. How could I be anything but grateful? That's what a thoughtful person does. And then for like the other 90% of humanity, I think that it's like he chews with his mouth open. I'm not grateful.
Yeah, I guess you might be right. Maybe also because the whole thing is it's automatic. I
Mhm.
mean,
I mean, so like, actually,
again,
you're
I'm
reminding me of my aunt who was so she was a single mom. She did everything for her kids materially, but always with a giant attitude of, oh, I'm sacrificing for you. My life is so hard. I give you everything. And as a result, she generated no gratitude at all. Her kids didn't like
right. So that, I mean, that's perhaps part of it though, because I'm sure you've heard this before. When it's automatic,
her.
then maybe you can have resentful. One of the
No, yeah,
advantages
like
advantages
a lot
of
of
local,
moms wouldn't have kept giving the money to her kids.
right?
But
Exactly.
she
One
was
advantage
there
of
like shoving the money and helping their faces all the same
right,
time with a frown. And
right, because
so this and the net package of a person I don't like giving me stuff, I take it and I resent you.
right. 'Cause, I mean, because one of the advantages of local charity is that someone could practice tough love. It's like I gave you money 3 times in a row.
Mhm,
3 times in a row, you brought alcohol with it. I'm not giving
mhm,
you any more money. Then I think the relationship is maybe a little bit more normal.
mhm.
Like you said,
Yeah.
if the mother could just said, "If you're not going to be thankful, I'll give you the money." If she gives the money anyways, that's when maybe the resentment only grows. Like, stop doing me any favors. I'm not asking for your favor.
Mhm.
Please.
I mean, a good way of thinking about it is this: what would a neutral observer say about the situation? And that's where I think you're right. A neutral observer will say, come on, this person is giving you help out of the goodness of their heart. And the fact that they're not a perfect human being doesn't really do much to undermine that fact. And you should be grateful. So
Right.
that
Right.
is, I think, what the right perspective is. And I think that if you imagine a Martian looking in on our culture and the way that we heavily tax the rich and then go and insult them and act like they shouldn't even get a thank you, it is a very weird attitude and
Yes.
a moral failing on the part of all human societies that I'm aware of.
But I do like the idea of having a national day of thank you. As long as we're going to have a welfare
Yeah.
state, I think there should be a national day of
Yep.
thank you. All right, my very last question. There is so much misinformation out there, and no matter how loudly you and others speak, the vast majority of people still believe lies and misrepresentations thanks to the left's stranglehold on education and culture. How do you propose we break through this stranglehold? Or do we simply ignore it and build a parallel American culture and educational system that will eventually replace the old one thanks to its quality and worth?
I agree that there is this cultural stranglehold of the left, although a lot of the stuff that I find objectionable is actually the bipartisan stuff. I think a lot of what's going on is, like I said, that there's some basic human emotions like envy and zero sum thinking, not thinking in terms of possibility of progress. This is very basic to our failed human nature. It takes a lot of work to rise above it. And then there is a whole set of philosophy, which you can think of as socialist or leftist philosophy, that takes these basic broken human emotions and then turns it into a philosophy with a pile of official justification. Now, what can be done about this? Well, the obvious thing is say something different. Look, there's an uphill battle here because what I'm going and trying to get people to accept that they've got some dysfunctional emotions, and instead of canonizing them as justified by philosophy, I'm trying to get people to calm down and think logically. I don't think it's that hard because most of the things that I say, look, they're not counterintuitive, they're just counter emotional. I say, look, calm down. We can't have any conversation until we're calm. And now I'm just going to say some things that, though ugly, are true. Like we're going back to that feminism conversation saying, look, there are multiple possible reasons why men and women might have different earnings. There's the one that we take for granted, and where if you criticize it, people try to silence you with fear. And then there's every other possible explanation. The other possible explanations are not crazy. In fact, they're totally reasonable. Some you'd have to be totally dogmatic to reject. Like if you say, well, men are a lot more likely to have any kind of paid employment. That explains a lot of why they make more money. Yeah. And another one is men are more likely to work more hours, to work full time, to work more than full time. That's another one. Right? Men are more likely to do STEM. That's another one. Men are more likely to do jobs that are unpleasant. 90% of all workplace fatalities are male. These things, I don't think that they are counterintuitive. It's not like, oh, it's just so weird. I figured that women were doing all the really dangerous work. That's not what people say. It's just of, I'm going to look at you with a look of, I will get angry at you if you start saying things that are true, if they go against my philosophy. So that's what I have in mind. I just try to stay calm and to go and say things that are correct. That's my general approach. I will say, so can you do any better than that? I mean, for me, honestly, what works best is humor. You'll notice that a large part of comedy is just saying things that almost everybody knows are true, that are ugly to say in polite company, and you say it in such a way that people crack up. That's basically the formula of comedy. So I try to do that. A lot of what I'm trying to do in the graphic novel format is by combining words and pictures, I'm not trying to appeal to emotions, but I am trying to at least diffuse the negative emotionality people are bringing to the topic so that they're willing to listen to a reasonable point.
On a larger scale, though, I mean, because I think there is some good movement in this direction. The question is if it's enough or what could be done more to advance. Like, I think the Daily Wire, I haven't seen it because I don't have small kids, but they apparently have a whole series of programming now for small kids. Instead of having to watch Sesame Street or whatever else is out there, which is apparently increasingly leftist, they now have their own kids' shows they can put their kid in front of and not have to worry that their kids will be taught to hate America. So they're sort of trying to build a culture which is more traditionally American rather than revolutionary leftist. And I mean, I think long term is probably the only solution. In the meantime, though, you go to your standard college. I mean, what is one Hillsdale and one? There's very few alternatives right now, and it's a big problem because most people are not exposed to you or or PragerU, which are also very good, but they're not exposed to it. So, on a larger level, how do we win the future?
For one individual, it's super hard, and it's easy to just say it's hopeless if you're just one person. I'd say, look, every one person makes a modest difference. If you have to ruin your life to make a modest difference, then that's depressing. On the other hand, if you can have a fantastic personal life while also making a modest difference, then that's pretty awesome. So that's what I've got. I get to be a university professor. I get to work on the stuff that I love. I nudge the world in a better direction, but I'm not living like Mother Teresa here. I've got a fine life and a rich, full life. In terms of like coming up with alternative media and so on, like there's a lot of things that you can do if you're motivated. So I've homeschooled all of my kids at some point, and some of them for a lot longer than others. During COVID, I was homeschooling them all. I recognize this is something that's inconvenient for most people. It worked for me, so I was able to do it. There's a lot of things where if you are motivated, you can do something really different. And then I think your thinking is more of what can we do for the people that aren't so motivated, that kind of sympathize, but don't want to go and turn their whole lives up and down over it. And it's like, well, it's a continuum as to how much you're willing to do. I mean, I think that even having your kids watch Daily Wire shows instead of regular kids programming, it's a pretty strong level of commitment, actually. You might think it's just a TV show. You have to be quite self-consciously opposed to the mainstream culture of our society to do something like that. I think part of what's happened is that the share of people that are willing to go and just be opposed to mainstream culture has expanded considerably in percentage terms, but still, I doubt it's even 20% of the population. The main reason to stay optimistic is just to realize that most people are so intellectually apathetic and just so tuning out. I have the slogan, ADHD will save us. When you go and hear about all the brainwashing in colleges, true, but remember, most of those professors have an attendance rate of like 50%, and the kids are playing on their phones, so they're not getting that brainwashed, actually. This is just reality. It's always been this way. When you go and see a student protest and say, this is the voice of their generation, like, no, it's 20 kids. They are not the voice of any generation. They speak only for themselves. And don't go and start feeling like the whole world is hopeless because you're so outnumbered. It's like, look, it's done with smoke and mirrors, and most people are just apathetic. And that's the reality. Like, oh, that doesn't sound that hopeful. It's like, well, it's more hopeful than the whole generation firmly disagrees with you. So there's that. What I tell people in terms of how can I live a good life, I say, look, you've got to go and make your own good life for yourself. And if you're going to let the world's not great intellectually or culturally make you miserable every day, you're making a terrible mistake. Don't do that. Make the most of your situation. It's awesome in so many ways. Like when I was a teenager, I was just bored out of my mind and so lonely because it was so hard to find anyone that wanted to talk about any ideas at all. Like no teenager in my situation has that problem anymore. That problem's been solved. So it's pretty awesome, actually. And I'd say the same for many other things in terms of winning the war of ideas, something like that. And it's like, well, super hard. Of course, it's super hard for anyone to win a war of ideas. That's part of having just basic free speech and free press, is that there isn't such a thing as final victory for anyone. Even if you do have censorship, it's not final victory.
Thank you so very much for that conversation. And it's a pleasure and honor meeting you.
All right, my pleasure. Have a great day, buddy.
All right, that does it for us. If you like this podcast, please consider subscribing to it and giving it a good rating and a nice review if you're so inclined. I hope you enjoyed the episode and have a great day or a great night, depending on when you're listening to this podcast.